Okay, I'm going to have a few lectures now about species distribution models because I have very specific material I want to give to you that is not well encompassed by any book chapter or uh, journal article. There's two important messages that I want you to come away from my lectures on species distribution modeling. One is that a species distribution model is an equation. Just like when you do a regression analysis, you get an equation. A species distribution model, though, is an equation that can be turned into a map. The next important thing that I want you to take away from these lectures is that a species distribution model does not tell you the probability of the species being present. Don't ever write that in your thesis, published articles, or say it in a presentation. A species distribution model does not ever tell you the probability that the species is present at any location. Species distribution models are also called ecological niche modeling. You'll hear that term a lot. If climate variables are used, species distribution models are called climate envelope modeling. You may also hear it referred to as habitat modeling or environmental niche modeling. All of the terms have their pros and cons in terms of the metaphors that they conjure that are not completely accurate, but I prefer the term species distribution model. The way that you make a species distribution model is that you take the locations of where the species occurs. You also take environmental data about what the habitat is like at the places where your species occurs. And then you make an equation based on what the habitat is like at the places where the species occurs. You make an equation relating how many of the species are found in different kinds of habitats. You make an equation relating how good different habitats are for the suitability of a species. And then there's a fourth step, which we'll talk about a little while later. The first thing that you do when you make a species distribution model is you go and you collect GPS data about where your species occurs. This GPS data can come from online sources, from people that have already recorded this information. It have to be from sources that you trust. Or this can be information that you've actually gathered yourself by visiting these locations and taking GPS readings of where your species occurs. The reason that species distribution modeling is needed is that we can't sample everywhere. So I'm showing you here the GPS coordinates for a plant species called Arabidopsis thaliana in Europe. The species occurs at more places than these points, but it's not possible to visit all of the places in the world where a particular plant occurs and get GPS coordinates for all of those points. What you have to do instead is take the limited information that you have and use it to try to make a forecast to other areas that you are just never going to be able to visit about other places where the species is likely to occur. Then, if you find other places where the species is likely to occur, you can target those places for follow-up visits to try to find more individuals of a particular species. So species distribution modeling starts with locations where you know that the species occurs because you've seen it there and you've taken GPS coordinates of those locations. And that location data is going to be limited. It's not going to tell you all the places where the species occurs because nobody can be everywhere. But it's going to give you some idea of where the species is found. The next thing that you need is environmental data. Environmental data is widely available online. And what you do is you download this environmental data. If you're going to be doing species distribution modeling, this should actually be another bumper sticker. Do not ever collect your own environmental data. Never collect your own environmental data for species distribution modeling. And if somebody wants you to do that as a part of a project that you're working on, you need to correct them that that is not going to work. Environmental data that you use for species distribution modeling has to be complete. I'm showing you here environmental data from the World Climate Consortium, showing what the weather is like at a given grain size across the entire world. In this case, I've got it narrowed down to just Western Europe, but this data actually will tell you the average annual temperature, the average precipitation, the seasonality of the weather, and other climatic things for any place on the globe in a something like 100-mile by 100-mile square. Think about how complete that data set is. Now, these data sets that are available online, sometimes they're not the entire world. Sometimes you only have this environmental data for all of the United States. A lot of that is available through the U.S. Geological Survey. You can read up on how the practitioners make these data sets that are so encompassing, that can tell you about the environment at any place on the earth or at any place within the United States. They do it through monitoring its strategic locations, and then they extrapolate to other areas beyond those locations to make a smooth surface, estimating what the environment is like across the entire world, or at least across the entire United States. Extrapolating is usually a bad thing. You shouldn't do it, but it's something that is done with care to make these environmental layers. Anyway, the point is that if you go and collect your own environmental data, you're not going to be able to collect environmental data for all of Europe or for all of the United States every 100 by 100 meters. So you need to let somebody else do that and have that data, because again, for an ecological, for species distribution modeling, your environmental data has to be complete. There can't be any gaps. So the take-home message here is never collect your own environmental data for species distribution modeling. Okay, so you have this complete information about the environment. At least for some environmental variables, and you've maybe gotten this data from the U.S. Geological Survey or from a World Climate Consortium. The next thing that you do is you put both of these pieces of information into some computer software. And the environmental variables are used to make predictions about what the habitat is like at the places where the species is found. So if the species is found according to the locations that you gave to the software, most often in soils with a particular pH, and it's found less often according to the points that you gave the software in places where the soil has a higher or a lower pH, then the species distribution modeling software is going to make an equation relating that environmental variable to how suitable the habitat is for the species. The basic idea is the places where you have found the species, what the environment is like at those places. Those are the best places where the species most likes to live. So, for instance, here's an equation generated by species distribution modeling software. On the x-axis here, you see soil pH, the acidity of the soil. On the y-axis here, you see habitat suitability for a species. And what you see here, this line is actually an equation. I could show you the y equals mx plus b plus bx plus whatever. But the bottom line is that the equation says that as soil pH increases, habitat suitability increases, but only until you reach about a pH of 5 or 6, and then the habitat suitability drops off. and becomes lower and lower as pH increases. So when you're doing species distribution modeling, you won't just have one environmental variable. You'll have these equations generated relating to habitat suitability of your species for all of your different environmental variables. And then these equations are used to predict other suitable areas for the species across an area of interest. So you can then take these equations and apply them to your environmental layers, because remember that we have environmental layers that you've put into the software that have complete information for what the environment is like for your entire spatial extent, in this case Western Europe. And so the software can use those equations together for each environmental variable and put them together and find the most suitable habitat according to those equations across the entire landscape. And this can give you ideas of other places to visit where you'd be most likely to encounter the species. Typically, these predictions are done in the form of a color-coded map, where the warmer colors indicate the most suitable habitat for a particular species. And the bluer colors represent the least suitable habitat, and green and orange and yellow represent intermediate suitabilities. So you can see that the most suitable habitat for this species is in southern England, northern Germany and Holland, and a little piece of the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Again, a species distribution model is an equation. It's an equation for each environmental variable, relating that environmental variable to how suitable the habitat is for a species. And you put all of those equations together into one mega equation. And this equation can be turned into a map, because you can take this equation and you can then apply it to your environmental layers to forecast other areas that have equally suitable or similar habitat to the places where you already found the species. Beware though, because extrapolation when you're doing species distribution modeling is not okay. So species distribution modeling, you have GPS coordinates for where a species is found. You have limited information, but you've got what you've got. Then you have environmental layers. Let's say this is precipitation, this is temperature, and this is soil acidity. And the software will make an equation relating the places where the species was found to what the environment was like at those places, and use that to predict how suitable habitat is for the species as a function of what the environment is like at different places. Then it can take those environmental layers and apply those equations, or I should say that one integrated equation, to make overall predictions of habitat suitability across the entire landscape. So ecological niche modeling is an equation that can be turned into a map that predicts other areas of suitable habitat for the species beyond just those that you sampled at. But you cannot extrapolate. So for instance, if you do ecological niche modeling on a species that lives in California, and your environmental layers are based on California, you cannot then take your equation that you get from a species distribution modeling and apply it to Texas, because that lies outside of the extent of your points and your environmental layers. Similarly, you cannot take an ecological niche model that you made for California and apply it across the entire globe, because that's outside the range of the spatial extent of California is smaller than the spatial extent of the entire world. The entire world's spatial extent is outside of the range of the spatial extent of California. So those are both different kinds of extrapolating that you cannot do. So you can do this. You can take your points and make predictions for California. You cannot take your points and make predictions for Texas. You cannot take your points and make predictions for the whole world if your spatial extent of your environmental layers and your points is for just California. All right, I will pick this up again starting here in the next lecture, part 2.